threw it in the curb and forgot to put it on the slide. Before I forget, I don't think Grant's here. At the end of service today, Terry, would you lead our closing prayer following our closing song? I asked Caleb to read from Proverbs chapter 14 because of the verse that is on the screen. There are some things that are stated in the Old Testament that I think are timeless, like righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a disgrace. You may want to go ahead now and turn in your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 8 in just a little while. We're going to read a passage from Deuteronomy 8. I think it's true, as you heard Lex pray, America has enjoyed a number of blessings of righteousness, and we also have suffered the disgrace of many sins. And it leaves us at an interesting point. Today we celebrate the 245th anniversary of our nation and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And I want you to indulge me this morning. I'm going to do something I've never done before and may never do again. I want to do a little bit more history than I have ever done before, just because today happens to also be the 4th of July. And I think there is so much that we owe to the early founders of our nation. And there's some lessons that I think that we can see from their work that are incredibly applicable today, and also some comparisons that we will draw. What they did prior to what we call the American Revolution was nothing short of courageous. We're talking about most of them lost their families, their jobs. Many of them lost their lives to give us the freedom that we have and that we enjoy. And I think that it is worthwhile that we talk about that. Now, I want you to be clear with me. I do not believe that God is a God of America. I've always had a little bit of a hang-up about that because it seems to imply that, well, everybody else kind of gets left out. I think that we're going to see that there was some religious principles that were embedded deeply in the founding of our nation, but we should never get to a point of thinking that we have some special relationship with God because of the land that we happen to have been born in. I want us to think about what we know and some of the signs that were based in patriotism about what happened at that time. August 2nd, 1776. John Adams said, "Whether we live or die, sink or swim, succeed or fail, I stand behind this Declaration of Independence. And if God wills, I am ready to die in order that this country might experience freedom." There are those who will argue that when the nation was founded, part of it was to get away from the repression of British religion. And that as a result, there was never an intent to tie our nation to God. If that's the case, there's an awful lot of evidence from the founding fathers of what their reliance on God was going to be. You see, the decision for them to break from England was not done easily or hastily. While they were living in colonies, the English citizens who were in this nation still felt like they enjoyed all of the rights and the privileges of every Englishman that was still in England. It was their ancestors who earlier, remember, had risen up against King John and demanded that he sign the Magna Carta because they didn't like the repressive nature and the dictatorial nature of what the king had become. And they were looking for that kind of freedom. And the Magna Carta became known as the Great Charter because they wanted to include in their lives freedoms that were being limited because of the king. Over the years, that changed. George began to ignore all of the things that had been pressed upon him, and the colonies were obviously concerned. There was great repressive taxes over them. There was lots of regulations, and they didn't feel like they had any representation whatsoever with England and the ruling hierarchy, and their lives were simply miserable. And when they complained to King George, he did what is my favorite part of the musical Hamilton. He sent the troops to make sure that they understood who was still in charge, and that he declares in this nation martial law, and it gives rise to public protest for what they considered were the intolerable acts that were being thrust upon them. There was a series of events, though, that history has recorded that turns out to be pretty significant. Eventually it gets out of hand, and it all kind of centers initially around Boston. On February the 22nd of 1770, a group of boys doing what boys do, they got things stirred up, and they started to turn into an angry mob, and the angry mob was then joined by angry adults. And their anger was directed outside the house of a British customs agent, a tax collector. And the boys had a tradition that when they wanted to rile somebody up, they threw rocks at their windows. Now this was long before Andy Griffith, okay? So this wasn't Ernest T. And they're throwing rocks at the windows. And unfortunately, one of the rocks that was thrown at the house of the customs agent went through the window and hit his wife. And he was trying to disperse the crowd, so he fired his weapon out the window to try to scare them off. And he hit an 11-year-old boy, Christopher Sider. Now, Christopher Sider technically becomes the first casualty in the Revolution. And it's a name that we never hardly ever hear about. Another event, though, was not long after March the 5th. Soldiers, again, trying to break up tax protesters. Somebody gave an order to the troops that commanded them to fire, and they did, and 5 protesters were killed. And in that group of 5 was a runaway slave, a multiracial man by the name of Crispus Attucks, who became very famous for what happened that day. And this became what would be known with the killing of these 5 as the Boston Massacre. And then we see about 14 months before the Declaration of Independence gets signed, 2 battles that were held against the troops and the militia. April the 19th, 1775, the Battle of Lexington. Now think about this with me, and this is something that we need to get our mind around. The British troops were the most powerful army on earth at this time, okay? Here they come, decked out. Everybody knows that the one thing you want to do when you're hiding out in the woods is to wear all bright red uniforms. Here they come. And in this particular battle, the Battle of Lexington, there were 700 British troops and 77 militia. And they fought. And what's interesting is that then the Minutemen and the British troops go on later, and we have the Battle of Concord, and there's 366 that were killed and wounded. And all of that was leading to increased tension. And before that battle, by the way, was when a guy by the name of Paul Revere rode through the streets to spread the warning that the troops were coming in. Unlike what we were taught in school, Paul Revere never screamed from his horse, "The British are coming, the British are coming." That is a legend, and it's wrong. And in fact, it was contrary to the strategy that they wanted to quietly let people know to be prepared. Didn't want to let the British know that they saw them coming. And they were, the militia, the Minutemen, were emboldened by how well they did under such great odds. 2 months later, June 17, 1775, we have the Battle of Bunker Hill. The colonial militia lost 400 men in that battle. And they had laid siege to Boston, and they lifted the siege afterwards. All of that leads to the conclusion that the Minutemen, who had to be ready in a minute's notice to go to battle, were emboldened by the fact that they were doing okay in these battles. Yeah, there were casualties, but there weren't nearly as many casualties as you would have expected. And as a result, their courage was increased and raised. And it leads us up to the point with all of these battles against Britain to some very historic and spectacular moments among the Founding Fathers. It leads up to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Patrick Henry was a man of incredibly deep faith. Now, remember what we said about God. Patrick Henry told a neighbor, "This book," referencing the Bible, "is worth all the books that were ever printed. It has been my misfortune to never have found the time to read it with the proper attention and feeling until I've been doing lately. And I trust in the mercy of heaven that it's not too late for me." On his deathbed, he was reported to have said, "Doctor, I wish you to observe how real and beneficial the religion of Christ is to a man who is about to die. I am much consoled by the reflecting that the religion of Christ has, from its appearance in this world, been attacked in vain by all the wits and philosophers and wise ones, aided by every power of men, and its triumphs are complete." Patrick Henry, who is credited with one who was an instrumental figure in the founding of our nation, was one who believed completely in the importance of the freedom that they could receive, and ties the future of our nation back to faith and belief in God. In his last will and testament, he said, "This is all the inheritance I give to my dear family. The religion of Christ will give them what they need to make them rich indeed." That's what he was leaving them, was their faith and their belief. Many of the forefathers paid a terrible, horrible price in the Revolutionary War. When they finally won that victory, they gave us a land that you and I today can still talk about and sing about, pray about, that's the land of the free and the home of the brave. And there have been many since then who have done so. But it's an interesting thing to think about in tying that bit of our history to what you and I need to learn about what our future looks like. Because in our modern celebrations, in declaring our independence, and when they declared their independence from Great Britain, they also were boldly declaring their dependence upon God. You don't do what they did against the odds they were facing unless you had some incredible faith somewhere. And it probably wasn't in the ragtag, thrown together neighbors of theirs who they were going to battle with. Yeah, that's right. In the beginning of our nation, our forefathers had boldly declared their dependence on God. But what's interesting, we know this wasn't the first nation to do that. Now, you've got your Bibles in Deuteronomy chapter 8. I want you to begin reading with me starting in verse 10. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 8, Moses is preparing the nation of Israel to go in and to receive the promised land. He says that in the verses early in chapter 8 that God has prepared you in the wilderness for this. He humbled you. He brought you to your knees. He gave you what you had to be protected. He gave you the food that you would have. He gave you what little bit of sustenance was going to keep you alive. And you need to understand the role that God did in protecting and defending and clearing out the land and getting ready for you. Verse 10. And he's talking about once you're in the land. When you've eaten and are full, Then you will bless the Lord your God for the good land which He's given you. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping His commandments, His judgments, and His statutes, which I command you today, lest when you've eaten and are full and built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness in which there were fiery serpents and scorpions. And you were in a thirsty land, there was no water, and He brought forth water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers did not know, and He might humble you to know that He might test you to do you good in the end. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. You will remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the power to get wealth, that He may establish His covenant which He swore to your fathers, as it is this day. Then it shall be, if by you any means that you forget the Lord your God, and follow other gods, and serve and worship them, I testify against you this day, you shall surely perish. As the nations which the Lord destroys before you, so shall perish, because you would not be obedient to the voice of the Lord your God. God knew what was in the hearts of the Israelites. What He had to do was to humble them so they would know what's in their hearts. And that's what He's attempting to do there. And when we see Moses' warning to them, that they needed to recognize and to remember what God had done, that is clear. And the notion of remembering what God has done is something that became secondary and foremost at the same time to what was going on in the colonies. In the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, it starts with these words: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Look at what the Founding Fathers wrote into the Declaration of Independence to indicate the role that God had played in their lives. If you want to say that they were not believers, well, they're talking here about the one who's provided to them everything. It is an obvious recognition of the impact of God on this new nation that they were creating. And at the end, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Any questions? We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. It is important to remember this clear declaration of their dependence upon God at a time when their world was in complete turmoil. You're already starting to make the application. It seems that through strong efforts to either ignore or erase our history and its reliance upon God. Yes, I understand what the separation of church and state is. And it's important to know that there was a deep and abiding faith in the Founding Fathers toward God, who gave us this opportunity, who gave birth to a nation and to its greatness. And so, while we have laws, it's imperative that we remember the role that God has played in all of this. One sort of summation here. After the crafting of the Declaration in the Constitutional Convention, long after debates and a lack of success in getting where they needed to be on the Constitution, Ben Franklin spoke at length. He was apparently quite an orator. And the gist of what he said in his speech that day is on the board. I've lived for a long time, And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without His notice, it is probable that an empire can rise. Is it probable that an empire can rise without His aid? You think Ben Franklin was saying that maybe we need to really stop and think about what role God is playing as we're attempting to do all this? I think I mentioned to you sometime back that I didn't like history in school. I really didn't. And I think it was, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say it's because I had bad teachers. I had teachers who were more interested in dates than they were in history. And now I've learned a little bit more about history than I ever thought that I would. Because on this particular occasion, this message was included in a sermon that was presented that day by a preacher. And they held a prayer in Congress that day. And they've held a prayer at the beginning of Congress every time since. Why? Because they recognize the role that God has played in the creation and in the history of our country. And as much as I love reading about Patrick Henry and George Washington and John Madden, especially Thomas Jefferson, there are so many other patriots that we could study about and find out how valiantly they gave of their best to try to make sure that you and I have the freedoms that we enjoy, and that we ought to remember them annually. And that's why this day is appropriate. And I think it's important as we make an application that we also remember that our independence depends upon our dependence. We need to be reminded of the same solemn warning that Moses gave to Israel. And he said, remember about what was like under slavery in Egypt. You and I, we need to remember what our history has been like in times where we didn't enjoy freedoms. And that was when we were under oppression from other nations, or before we were a nation. And although the Declaration was written so many years ago, I would suggest to you that probably the Declaration that was written over 3,400 years ago would still be very appropriate. You need to remember our dependence upon God. He brought you out, He made sure you had everything you needed, and look at what you have been given. I hear people often talk about, I hear people pray about that we have been fortunate enough to be blessed to live on the greatest, wealthiest, most resource-rich nation on earth. And some of that's true. And at the same time, when I look back and I see the warnings of what were given to Israel about the land that God was about to give to them, basically what they were being told is, look, you need to remember who gave it to you and don't mess it up. And so our independence depends upon our dependence. In verse 10 he said, when you have eaten and you're full, and then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which He has given you. Moses said to them, when you have been satisfied, you need to remember where all this came from. But did they? I guess more importantly, the question that you and I have to deal with is, do we? Do we recognize how greatly we have been blessed? Because in verses 11 through 14, he said, beware that you don't forget the Lord. When your heart's lifted up, you forget the Lord your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Do we forget the role that God played in the creation of our nation? Do we recognize, as much as I love reading the history stories about all of the wonderful and courageous and incredible things that the founding fathers and the early, and what all the soldiers have done to keep us free since then, we should always understand that all of them take a second position to God. It is an important history lesson that shouldn't be forgotten. But is it too late for us? Because you see, this history right here is not being taught anymore. And we have largely figured out how to forget about what God does and has done. And we have become very much like what they were worried about. And the admonition to watch out that you don't forget God. And here's why. A great nation is not built on its military power or its national wealth. China has incredible wealth. A lot of its debt that we owe. Russia has incredible military. Why is it we believe our nation is the great nation? Well, it depends upon how, as a nation, we view righteousness and justice. That's what makes a great nation a great nation. And that's why Solomon said what Caleb read. Righteousness exalts a nation. And that was the case then, and it still is today. But think about what's happening in our culture. You know, where the modern objectives of our lives has been to become successful and have status and have security, closely followed by self-indulgence and comfort and pleasure. AKA, it's all about me. You remember when we had laws that prohibited a lot of vices? You know, that when we celebrated as a nation that everybody got to get drunk again after Prohibition. You know, and now we worry about all these states that are giving rise to allowing marijuana. I would tell you that it's just another in a long series of vices that we have allowed to come forward in our country. It was a problem long before this. And when we think that things have gotten so black in our country, we need to go back and read Deuteronomy again. We need to think about the fact that this isn't the worst time in history. And to know that God is still with us just like He was still with them. And when Paul said in Titus 3, at one time we were foolish, disobedient, deceived, and entangled by all kinds of passions and pleasures, we lived in malice and envy, being hated and hating one another. Now, that was written and given by Paul. It wasn't written in 2019. But it could have been. And that's why we have to think about what the sort of enslaving nature of sin does. Because we were all about freedom. Our founding fathers sacrificed so much for our freedoms. And is what we're going through by allowing so much permissiveness, is that freedom? Is that what the founding fathers wanted when they were guaranteeing freedoms, that we would get to where we are today in the name of freedom? It's kind of like the question when you look at all of the various churches that exist out there. Is that what God intended? Did God intend for there to be, 1,900 different versions of a church? Or would God say, you messed up what was perfect? The founding fathers might look at us today and say, look at the mess that you have created from what we did. And people who are caught up in sin think that they're free. That in reality, they are slaves to sin. You go to a wino on any street corner and say, I would like to save you from alcoholism. And they're going to tell you the same thing. I'm not a slave to anybody. How many people who are strong with addiction will tell you, oh, I can quit at any point before they die? You see, they are slaves. They're not free. That's what the Scriptures has taught us. Last week, we talked, I think it was last week, we talked about the prodigal son. You remember his notion? Set me free, Father. And the wise father gave him his inheritance and let him run off in his freedom. And he enjoyed that freedom until he didn't have any more money. And then he didn't have any more friends. And then he didn't have any more shelter. And he didn't have any more food. And then he remembered where freedom was when he came to himself and went back to the Father. That's where he was able to understand that freedom means being free from the things that he had discovered while he was away. He became free again when he understood what dependence was like. And our real freedom only comes with an acceptance of Christ. And if we were to step back as a nation at this point and ask ourselves, where were the founding fathers and what were their aims and what were their ambitions when they were attempting to create a new nation, I think what they would discover is a complete and total dependence upon the way that God would lead them going forward. But for those who are slaves in sin, we need to thank God that we have freedom in Christ. And that we have so much more freedom in Christ than the Constitution could ever grant us, because our freedom is in Jesus. And interestingly, the word for freedom is in the New Testament is the word redemption. And redemption means to be set free. How do we become set free? How do we get ultimate freedom? It is when we learn how to be redeemed. It means that we've been bought with a price, that we have been freed from the bondage of sin, and now we are really free. Free indeed. And Paul wrote to Titus and he says, "For the grace of God teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and the freedom and the grace of God teaches us how to live self-controlled, upright, godly lives in this present age." There's freedom when you have total control over what your life is going to be like, and when we surrender ourselves to live godly lives, the total freedom that we have gives us everything that we could possibly imagine. Because in Titus he said, because Jesus Christ gave himself for us to redeem us from all the wickedness and to purify for himself a people that are his very own, eager to do what is good, zealous unto good works. That's what redemption is. If you are really a patriot, you're really concerned about America, you will earnestly want God's blessing upon our country. But that means that we will work to every end to live a life that is in harmony with the will of God. They have to know it. We have to commit ourselves to it. We have to struggle forward with it. And we have to commit to help each other and to carry each other when necessary.